So eventually, this period between Romulus and the second king of Rome is resolved. The citizens demand a new king. They are tired of this temporary compromise that has been reached, particularly between the Sabines or the Sabine powers in Rome and the more sort of native inhabitants, and they agree on a particular individual who seems to kind of rise above these ethnic conflicts. And this individual is Numa Pompilius. Pompilius does have Sabine origins, but is apparently, as far as we can tell, accepted by all Romans. That Livy tells us that there's a certain amount of compromise involved in the election of Numa Pompilius, but that his just qualifications allow him to rise above the fray. Among Numa's various reforms, he is an incredibly religious person. So he funds the construction of temples. He brings a number of cults from other cities around Rome back into Rome. One of these is the Vestal Virgins that he brings from Alba Longa. He enacts a range of civil laws. So we're told that Romulus, as the first king, does pass some laws. He tries to put some order on his community. But in general, Romulus's Rome is often compared to Numa Pompilius's, and the contrast is really between a kind of military state that Romulus was running and a more civilized, based in law state that Numa Pompilius had created. Numa also created a calendar, so a sense of marking time, but in particular of deciding that certain days would be devoted to the worship of divinities, and that on those days it was illegal, in fact, to carry out certain kinds of activities, for instance, purchasing goods. And so certain days would be considered what is called nephos, and others would be phos. And so on a phos day, which is a good day, you could carry out a range of activities. On nephos days, you needed to, those activities were actually prohibited. The other thing that Numa very famously does is he brings peace to Rome. And this is what, by later writers, he's very frequently celebrated for. And is cited by later Romans as the sort of ancestor of pacifying Rome. He marks this bringing of peace, he commemorates it, by building a temple to the two-faced god Janus. And Janus is described as having sort of two faces, and for the Romans, one is peace and one is war. And in their temple of Janus, when the Romans are at war, they leave the doors of the temple open to signify that they're in a state of war. And when peace has been established, when the city is safe and secure and at peace, the doors are closed. And these doors are very infrequently closed. For the most part, Rome spends its entire time as a republic and into the empire at war. And so Numa building this temple and then closing the doors of it is deeply symbolic and resonates very strongly, particularly in the late Republic and early Empire. And here we have a picture of Numa Pompilius on the left-hand side of your slide. And this is actually a statue, and you can see here that he's represented in the guise of a philosopher. And this is, in your Livy, you note that Livy talks a lot about the stories going around that, in fact, Numa was trained as a philosopher, and that this is part of why he's such a devout religious man, why he's a wise king. And Numa really embodies this notion of what's called the sapiens, or the philosopher king, that will come up again when we get into the empire, but very much contrasted to Romulus, whose strengths were not, Romulus was a hoodlum. Romulus's strengths were military. And so, in a sense, if you combined Numa and Romulus, you get what's sort of the best of the Romans. that combination of military might and bravery with wisdom and learning. So there's a series of other kings that carry out various good projects for Rome. They allow Rome to prosper, but in certain senses aren't terribly remarkable. And Livy rehearses some of the things that these different kings do, including building walls around the city as it was in its current state, fighting wars with neighboring tribes and so forth. But things really sort of reach a head when Tarquin the Proud seizes the kingship. And Tarquin rules for a significant amount of time, from 535 to 509. And prior to Tarquin, as we were talking about, kings were really considered, for the most part, beneficent patrons. They were father figures. They were wise, as Numa Pompilius was. They did good things for Rome. They were patrons that made sure that the city was safe, that the citizenry was safe. But Tarquin the Proud really redefines what it means to be king. First of all, he's not elected. He seizes the monarchy and, in fact, masterminds schemes to make sure that the previous king, Servius Tullius, is executed. And one of the things that's interesting about Tarquin seizing the kingship is that it betrays his sense that he believed that it was rightfully his. His father had been king before Servius Tullius, and Tarquin really had this view that it should be hereditary. But this wasn't how kingship worked in Rome. And so he represents a break even with this notion of the king as elected and as having demonstrated his suitability to rule. Tarquin the Proud, on the other hand, just seizes it. He shows that if you really, can get a conspiracy going, you may well be able to seize the kingship. And here we have on the left-hand side of your slide a comic that's really demonstrating the view that Tarquin was not the best of kings. So you see him sitting above everybody else, sort of legs splayed, big fat belly, looking every bit the tyrant. And Tarquin is very much remembered as a tyrant. This is the persona that is created for him by later historians. We do know after he became king, he plotted the murder of senators that were favorable to the previous king. So in other words, he gets rid of anybody that might possibly set in motion a challenge to his rule. And again, this was something that was unheard of in Rome, that you didn't just kill off senators because they were going to support the previous king, or they might possibly disagree with you. The whole idea of the Senate, in its ideal form, was that it was an advisory body that helped keep the powers of the king in check. And what Tarquin does is make sure that the Senate is filled with people that are just going to rubber stamp his decisions. He repealed recent changes to the Roman constitution that were favorable to the citizenry, and enacted a series of despotic laws. So he was, again, sort of every bit the tyrant. He used his power as king to really bring down the hammer on Roman citizens. His reign is very much characterized by bloodshed, violence, and persecution, at least as it's reported by Livy and by other historians. We know that, or we're told, that he treated his enemies treacherously, so he didn't play fair, in other words. Livy tells us the story of how he had his son Sextus actually infiltrate one of the neighboring towns, the Gabii, in order to take them down. So again, this isn't sort of normal Roman warfare where you go out and you defeat an enemy through your own superior forces, through your own bravery in the face of danger. It's conspiracy, it's treachery. This is the mark of a tyrant, not a good king. And eventually, Tarquin is driven into exile in the year 509 BC, after his son Sextus rapes the wife of a nobleman. And this wife's name is Lucretia. And in class, we'll be talking about the rape of Lucretia in quite a lot of detail, breaking it down and looking at the role of Sextus Tarquin and the Tarquins, as well as Brutus. But we also need to look at our sources for Tarquin before we close the chapter on him. And so one of the things that we want to ask ourselves is the extent to which Tarquin just received bad treatment by the historians, that he was an easy target for casting in the role of the tyrant because he's the last king, because after him we have then the Roman Republic. And so in order to create this sense of a strong divide between the regal period and the Republic, it's important to have somebody be the bad guy. And Tarquin plays that role pretty well. Some of the positive things that Tarquin does include, for instance, under his leadership, Rome becomes really the leader of a federation of Latin cities. So Rome is emerging now as the strongest power in Latium. And this is an important fact. It not only means that Rome is more militarily secure, but it allows Rome to exercise more control over what happens outside of its borders, and raises the potential for having, for instance, more men that can serve in the military, access to crops, and so forth. And so Tarquin is really doing a lot to extend the power of Rome, to stabilize it and extend it. He's a skilled military leader. There's no question about that. Even in Livy's account, where he's making every effort to cast Tarquin in the wrong as a tyrant, as somebody with no morals. It's clear that he is tactically very clever and brave. And in a number of instances, he protects Rome from attacks. Most clearly, as Livy tells us, an attack from the north, from the Etruscans, a culture, a set of cities that were, at this time, a serious rival to Rome, and in many ways stronger than Rome. And so for Tarquin to be able to defend Rome effectively, to create these alliances with other cities in Latium, is really a significant achievement. The other thing that he does that is worth mentioning is he undertakes the construction of a temple to Jupiter. This becomes the temple to Jupiter Optimus Maximus that persists all the way into the empire. Tarquin's temple doesn't survive, but the grounds on which it's built, it's rebuilt a couple of times. Now, Livy tries to make it sound like this sort of great devotional act isn't so great. He talks about how he funds it by using not only booty that he gets from captured tribes, so in other words, the spoils of war, but also taxes his own people. He takes stuff from his own people to fund the construction of this temple. So Livy sort of takes what is really a remarkable act and an act that shows Tarquin's devotion to the gods and casts it again in the worst possible light. He mentions, just as a sideline, the fact that Tarquin also builds seats in the circus, so in other words, provides the opportunity for public entertainment, and he builds a sewer system. So indicating that, first of all, the population of Rome is growing, that it needs an actual sewer system, that you can't just go poop in the Tiber River, which is literally what the Romans did, but that now it's necessary to have a sewer system that will run from different houses and carry out waste. Still ran into the Tiber River, but at least it wasn't just everybody running to the river and doing their thing. But these are important public construction projects that again show, in fact, Tarquin acting like previous kings as the beneficent patron of the city. So it's important to keep in mind, again, that our sources have a story to tell, and that they're not always just reporting the facts. In particular, Livy, when he comes to deal with Tarquin, goes out of his way to cast everything he does as evidence of Tarquin's tyranny, and isn't going to highlight any of the positives. And this is a reconstruction of the temple of Jupiter that Tarquin built. Again, you can see it's very much built on the model of the Etruscan temple that you saw in an earlier lecture. The temple form that comes to Rome is very Etruscan in style, built on a podium with the columns that offer a porch before you enter into the main room, where the devotional statue to the god, the cult statue to the god, would have been housed.